All right, hello everyone. Today I am joined by some Talos and Cisco Secure researchers who are going to be talking to us today about election security, mainly focusing on the disinformation portion of things. So, as you might have seen on the Talos blog over the past few weeks, we've had two different research papers go up so far, with another one on the way, basically going over everything that we know about election security to this point. And this is kind of combining months and months of research on our part and talks with our partners, both government and private, and basically pulling together everything that we know about the threats that America is facing going into the 2020 election. Today, I wanted to get some of our folks together who have been working on these blog posts and papers and have been part of this discussion. So I'm just going to start off by letting you guys introduce yourselves. And since you are at the top left, Gene, I will start with you. If everyone could just go around and say hi and talk about what your role in Cisco security is.
Sure. So my name is Jean Gordon Kushenda, and I'm a global threat analyst. I've been in the security and trust organization for quite a while. I've been with Cisco for 14 years, and I have the great pleasure of following the news and thinking about what geopolitical events mean for the technology security world as well as the world at large.
Hey everyone, my name is Kendall McKay. I'm on Cisco Talos's threat intelligence and interdiction team, on specifically the strategic analysis team within TNI. So we do a lot of threat hunting, but also work on more strategic products, specifically looking at threats that kind of occur over a long period of time. So it's a great team to work on to sort of blend both the strategic and tactical analysis at Talos. And as far as the disinformation work, I've personally been working on a bunch of different products here at Talos, both some in-house products on sort of broader disinformation topics, but then also the latest paper that we put out on the building blocks of political disinformation campaigns.
My name is Matt Felitis. I work on Talos's outreach team with Nick. I'm out on the West Coast representing the Bay Area. For the political disinformation campaign, I've been working on the infrastructure piece, so understanding all the moving bits and the people that make these disinformation campaigns effective.
And lastly, we have Nick Biasini, who listeners of the Talos Takes feed will be familiar with by now.
Again, everybody, my name is Nick Biasini. As Matt said, I am a member of the outreach team inside of Cisco Talos. Basically, I hunt threats. Most of my day is spent looking at malware. This has actually been kind of a fun reprieve. I've had a lot of personal interest in disinformation over the last couple of years as we've watched everything that happened in 2016. But this is the first opportunity to be able to really dive deep on it from a professional perspective. So it was a lot of fun.
So this is going to kind of be a free-flowing discussion, so you guys can feel free to answer in any order that you'd like. And if you have something to add, please just jump in. And for starters, I just want to get to the basics. What does disinformation consist of?
It's kind of a broad topic. So at its core, the way that I look at it is a way to amplify information that is partially true or has kind of a biased opinion on it. And then the disinformation is the process of getting it out, amplifying it, and getting it into mainstream media.
I think the important component of disinformation that people often get confused with misinformation is it's the creation of false content with the intent to deceive. So there's that malicious component to it, whereas misinformation by definition is the creation of false content without the intent to deceive. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's really that malicious intent to dupe people. And in terms of disinformation, we see that so widely used when it comes to election interference and political influence.
I would just add to that, completely agree, particularly about the fact that for me, disinformation has kind of an agenda. And I've been doing some research recently for a blog on COVID-19 and disinformation. And one of the interesting parallels when you start looking at a virus like COVID-19 and you start looking at disinformation and you realize all of these parallels, the CDC in fact said that basically there are three things that you need to spread a disease. You need a pathogen, you need a vulnerable recipient, and you need a means of transmitting that pathogen from one person to the next. And disinformation in so many ways acts just like a virus.
I'll lastly add that the goal isn't necessarily to make everyone believe every piece of disinfo. Just sowing doubt in what the truth is often enough for the adversary to achieve their goals, or at least move towards their goals.
One final point to make too is this is not new. A lot of this focuses on what happened in 2016, but this concept of disinformation has literally been around for decades and decades. It's been something that has been used heavily by nations for a very, very long time. The biggest change right now is just the means, the use of social media, and the much lower risk associated with the activity than there used to be.
You mentioned, Nick, that this has been in use for decades, but one of the things most recently that has made disinformation campaigns more popular and in some ways more successful is social media. And we've covered that very heavily, obviously, in our reports and blog posts. So, what can we say about how things like Facebook groups?
I'll jump in and say that I think that one of the ways that it works really well is that there almost always is a kernel of truth to what is being said. And that makes it, particularly when it's something that someone that you trust is sending to you, and there's that either that kernel of truth sort of combined with that gray area of ambiguity just makes it just makes social media this loaded weapon in a sense.
I think the speed to dissemination is also pretty critical here compared to some of the previous ways, like Nick has mentioned, that disinformation was happening rather than dropping pamphlets out of a plane or pushing an agenda on a news site, a news radio program that someone has to dial into. Social media gives you an immediate ability to reach out to your constituents, and as well as for those constituents to amplify your message for you to reach an even broader audience, which is really unheard of in the previous methods of disinformation dissemination.
These social media platforms are just like the perfect environments for these threat actors to enlist the help of unwitting people to spread their messages. I mean, John, you mentioned Facebook groups. It's something we talk about in the latest paper that we wrote. And in the paper, we talk about the idea of information silos and how most social media networks will sort of, they'll suggest pages for you to like, they'll suggest groups for you to join or people to connect on and to connect with. And that's all based on your current interests. And so they really promote you connecting with like-minded people. And threat actors know this all too well. And so the Facebook groups in particular provide an excellent source of like-minded people with similarly held beliefs to tap into. And so we've seen in our research that threat actors will leverage Facebook groups, for example, and push their narratives in there. And they'll instruct people to repost that content elsewhere, either on their personal pages or, post it on a different platform entirely. And, by nature, usually someone who joins a Facebook group might be more passionate about that particular topic. So they're already sort of predisposed to being excellent sources of amplifiers for these actors.
And one final point here is around risk, right? When you look at what used to be required to do this type of activity, you had to have people physically in these locations, building these relationships, working on that. Today, I mean, we're in a pandemic state where everyone's working from home. You could literally walk into the office in your house, fire up your, 50, 100, 200 Twitter accounts you have, and start your disinformation campaign. If you get busted, your accounts get shut down, you just start over again. There's no risk to the country or the group for doing this, right? There's no consequence really for their actions. They can just keep going and going and going.
the next topic that I want to get to is news sites. And there's a lot of sites out there that will intentionally distribute only disinformation or, intentionally misleading headlines, that kind of stuff. But also, there are legitimate news sites that can kind of fall victim to disinformation as well. So let's talk about the two sides of that coin. One being that it's so easy for folks now just to spin up their own website and make it look like a legitimate news source. But then also the fact that these established news sources can also become targets of disinformation campaigns that people know and trust already.
So I'll start with some of the fake news websites that it doesn't take much to grab a domain that's available that says something like, fake news checker, for instance, which is pretty much one of the sites that we found that was used in a 2019 Tunisian presidential elections. And the whole purpose of the site was ostensibly to point out fake news and to shed light on fake news, while in effect it was actually doing the exact opposite and was pushing the same types of fake news that it claimed to be highlighting. The barrier entry to do this is extremely low. You register a website, you create some content and put it on there, and then you have to disseminate that information. And social media is such a great way that we talked about to drop some links into some news groups or in some Facebook groups, or to send out links that are that support your agenda. And as long as someone attaches to that and amplifies it, your job is to some degree done, right?
We're seeing more of a bubble up on that as well, an evolution, if you will, because now we're seeing not just the original fake news sites, but fake authors and fake writers and fake reporters getting pulled into larger news sites and reporting on larger sites, but still having questionable backgrounds. And then even more recently, we have the additional evolution of actors starting to actively potentially attack websites and add content to existing legitimate websites, which adds yet another layer of extreme difficulty around vetting content, even on platforms that you trust.
Even on like legitimate news sites, you see disinformation trickling on to those sources. By and large, legitimate news outlets don't report on disinformation narratives. It's ethically questionable. But sometimes those stories end up on there in indirect ways. So, for example, during our research, we came across there's been reporting that there's been many U.S. congressional candidates running for office who have aligned themselves with QAnon conspiracy theories and the QAnon platform. Well, that story in and of itself is newsworthy because they're U.S. congressional candidates. However, when a legitimate news outlet mentions that and says these candidates are tying themselves to a QAnon platform, even without explaining what QAnon is or what those ideologies are, they're putting the name out there. And so people who might not know what QAnon is are going to hop online, do a quick Google search, and that's where the cycle starts. And the other thing I'll say too is that a lot of the disinformation originates from the perpetrator's home country. So a lot of state media outlets in places like Russia and China and elsewhere in the world, known kind of disinformation actors, have branches that are located in other parts of the world. They're English language branches, and they're meant to push content out to the West and to English-speaking audiences. And so sometimes US news sources, legitimate news sources, will pick those stories up and carry them because ostensibly they're coming from legitimate state media in other parts of the world. So there's certainly fake websites out there that host this kind of information, but we see it trickling more and more frequently onto the mainstream media. And I think that's where it's reaching, larger and larger audiences.
One final point of things to pay attention to as well is all these large sites, large reputable sites now do sponsored content. So you're going to have content that's going to be sponsored from other sites. So you're going to be branching into other sites a lot of times without even realizing it. You click a link on webpage X, but it's actually sponsored content from webpage Y, which links to webpage Z. So you never really know as easily as you would want the true origins of the data you're looking at as well.
And now I want to talk about what these actors' end games are. But in the case of these disinformation campaigns, it's not even really so much about swaying someone's opinion one way or the other. It's to sow discord essentially and build upon these cultural lines that are cultural dividers that are already out there. So, what can you guys tell me about what the goals are exactly of some of these actors that we've been talking about?
You mentioned it already. The real goal here is to sow discord. So there's a lot of narratives about one side versus the other side, but as has been shown time and time again, these adversaries tend to play on both sides, and the messaging and the things and the goals that they're trying to achieve vary widely depending on which angle they're trying to pursue. But their actual goal is just to sow chaos, sow discord, and make you distrust what you would normally trust, like Western democracy, for example.
And the important thing to realize is that the actors aren't typically creating new narratives that aren't there in the target society. They're exploiting divisions that already exist. And so they're very keen on understanding the population that they're trying to influence and the divisions that already exist within those populations, whether it be racial tensions, you name it. And so we've seen so much of that, I think, especially lately with the George Floyd protests being exploited by disinformation actors, COVID-19, things like that. And so it's I think you guys hit it right on the head. Even if there's not a specifically stated outcome, like we want X candidate to win an election, the fact that an actor can make the population either more polarized, more tribal, or doubt the institutions and the democratic process is a win for them. That's going to have long-lasting effects.
Just the ability to impact the trust in the system is enough for an adversary to consider that somewhat successful, right? They don't necessarily have to have people completely buy into the agenda that they're seeding, as long as people just have start to distrust whatever the underlying process is. So from an election standpoint, whether it's vote tallying, whether it's an agenda, a politician's agenda, any one of those things that you can impact and disrupt the trust that a voter has, you've done your job. So there's a lot of attack surface then from an election perspective for these adversaries.
I kind of imagine it like, when you were a kid on the playground and there were those spinning things. I don't even know what you call them, where all you have to do is get the thing going, and it's going and stuff is flying off of it. And all you have to do is every now and then you need to give it just one more push. And you kind of get the feeling that in a lot of these election scenarios that the disinformation spinner started spinning a long time ago, and after a while whatever the external actor was simply needs to give it a little push every now and then, and it'll keep going.
And so now I want to get into some real world examples of how threat actors have put this into use. And we outline a couple in the disinformation research paper that we recently put out. But what are some of the most notable ones that you guys have come across in your research, and even just things that are publicly available, whether it be like government, there's a bunch of government reports out there now that folks can find on their own about documented examples of this.
Let me just start by saying that in my reading, I've been impressed at the extent to which the European Union has really focused on being more upfront and more verbal about their charges of misinformation from state actors. They've been very clear about their sense that Russia has tried to interfere in the European Parliament elections of 2019. There have been charges connected to Brexit and to increasing disunity within NATO and the European Union itself. Interestingly, I find that the European Union announcements on these topics tend to be non-specific. So they won't tell you exactly what the disinformation story was, but they will tell you that it's happening. And I think that that leaves us to run around trying to figure out what exactly it was that needs to be debunked. But it's a specific development that I would point to.
For me, it's not so much specific campaigns as it is this worrying trend about companies specializing in this. Once you have private companies that specialize in running disinformation campaigns, this becomes increasingly dangerous. Now you don't have as much tie back to what, it's not focused on what country or origin it's coming from, because now you have a machine that's operated to do this. And it branches outside of politics and can really and truly branch into anything, which should be concerning to everyone, because now disinformation could start falling into everything you're doing in your day-to-day lives.
It's not just the private companies that Nick talked about they're private companies, right? And they operate like private companies. So not only are they delivering this content, but they're doing things like measuring how effective they were at delivering that so they can improve future campaigns. I thought that was really interesting to see examples where they might push disinformation that supports both sides of an agenda. And they might do that so that they can see, okay, well, who responds in what way and how quickly do they do that, so that they know where users fall on both sides of the spectrum to further target them at a later date in a different way. And similarly, we saw things where these agencies were submitting things like quizzes or other things that maybe weren't, they were tangential to the disinformation message they wanted to push, but the goal was to collect information on, okay, what color quiz was more effective, or where did we have more quicker response from users for this particular messaging, and then use that information to make the disinformation dissemination even more effective. So very polished from a business perspective. It makes the campaigns look rather professional.
So, all this stuff can sound pretty scary, kind of overwhelming. When you get down to things like you're talking about state-sponsored actors or, just social media as a whole. Like, social media is not going to go away overnight. These are all things that are intrinsic parts of our lives now. So, I'm basically just going to throw it out there as to what can be done to address some of these campaigns. And I would pose that question, looking at it from the perspective of individuals as consumers of news, but also things like any legislation that could be passed, or any broader initiatives or anything like that that could happen.
And it lies with the user, right? At its core, it's the user's responsibility to vet the data that you're looking at. And that is really what the problem is. If users would take time to vet the data and analyze it, they probably wouldn't have as much a problem with disinformation. But in today's society, in today's world, it's you're very instant gratification driven. So that level of vetting just isn't there.
I agree with Nick completely that it ultimately falls on the consumer. However, we know that many people, don't think twice about the information they consume, or don't care, or may not think that disinformation really exists in their sphere of information that they consume. So, it will also lie on the social media companies' backs to try to figure this out. And we're sort of seeing in real time social media platforms sort of find their way through the dark on this issue. I mean, we see Facebook removing content. We've seen Twitter flagging certain tweets with flags, with additional context about the tweet's veracity and things like that. But it's a constant struggle between trying to police disinformation and foreign influence while also not infringing on First Amendment rights. And so I think we've also seen that battle play out in Congress, where there really hasn't been any meaningful legislation passed because it's such a difficult topic to grapple with anytime you're trying to tackle a problem that involves technology and freedom of speech.
Quite the opposite, actually. I think, 1987, the Federal Communications Commission eliminated the fairness doctrine, which said that if you're a news source and you're presenting a story, you have to present equal views on both sides of that story. So when you eliminate that, you now allow news agencies to present only one side of the story if they want. And so this has led to liberal versus conservative news sites, which makes understanding the truth of an issue from a consumer perspective really difficult, because these trusted news sites themselves are not even presenting both sides of the argument. So it becomes very difficult for consumers to understand what is truth.
And I think one of the ways that the social media has tried to attack this, and I think it's a noble attempt, is by going after the authenticity of the source, right? So not the word itself, not the story itself, because nobody wants to be the arbiter of truth, of absolute truth, but rather, is this purveyor, is this source of information misrepresenting itself? So I think that's a good try, but it seems like, as far as I can see, it hasn't been particularly successful. The other thing I want to add is that on a personal level, I certainly am wrapped around an axle over how to approach my friends and family on this issue if I see them propagating something which I believe to be inaccurate. And I think all of us probably on some level don't want to ruin Thanksgiving dinner for everybody else. So at what point do we get involved with friends and family and tell them that we believe they're wrong? Or to Kendall's point earlier, even giving any additional airtime to some of these questions makes it seem more valid. So I don't know if I'm just being a wimp if I simply refuse to take up the discussion.
I will say, if I can, that Nick mentioned it's on the users or on consumers to understand what's right and wrong, and the social media platforms have provided means of users to take action if they see something that they think is pushing a narrative that's not true. Facebook has a really good transparency report, and we pulled a ton of information from these transparency reports for the latest research bit that we did, where they once disinformation campaigns and abusive accounts and Facebook pages and things like that are discovered, they'll publish their findings on that. They'll publish what agencies and or nation states were presumably behind the campaign. They'll publish information on how many accounts and groups were behind it, as well as the ad spend. And so you can get an idea of what goes into these sorts of things, what confirmed malicious disinformation campaigns look like. Similarly, Twitter has a similar transparency report as well. So from the platform side, there are some things that you can both submit to as well as learn from if you want to educate yourself more on this. Or
yeah, and honestly, as a final point, to their credit, the social media companies have done a good job of starting to tag things that are potential misinformation or disinformation. Part of the problem is, for instance, in the research, we were looking at Facebook groups, and I found a March Against Biden Facebook group. Almost every post in that Facebook group was tagged as misinformation or disinformation, and there was still 60 posts a day. So yes, it's great that they do tagging, but if the people that are actually reading it don't care, they're just going to continue to post misinformation and disinformation over and over again.
Yeah, and we saw with the Kenosha protests that one of the groups that was organizing those protests, there were over 500 submissions from users that this was, this was something that the platform shouldn't be promoting, and yet still it didn't get taken down. So while there are means to do this, as Nick points out, there's still room for improvement, of course.
I just want to throw it back to you guys to tell me what I missed. Is there anything else that you particularly found interesting that you want to hammer home, or any points, that I missed so far?
For me, since my focus is primarily on infrastructure, one of the things that I found most interesting was that you could basically run an open source disinformation campaign. There are open source tools and libraries and scripts that are out there that basically allow you to conduct these types of campaigns using nothing but open source software. It doesn't by any means mean you'll be successful, because it is difficult to operate a successful campaign, but the ease with which you can launch a disinformation campaign was surprising, at least to me.
One thing that I'm thinking about a lot that I don't know if it belongs in this recording or not, but the question of the looming COVID-19 vaccine and the politicization of that. And, you know, clearly there is a growing understanding that without some kind of an effective treatment or an effective vaccine, where the global economy is not going to be able to move on past the pandemic. However, you know, as I said earlier about the kernel of truth, there is I think a relevant concern about how vaccine research is being pushed faster than it normally would. And at the same time, there is emerging sort of this anti-vaccination argument that I think is critically concerning because of the undermining of trust and faith in getting vaccines. If people don't get vaccines, if everybody doesn't get the vaccine, that the herd immunity idea doesn't work. And so I feel like this is a looming issue that we're probably going to be dealing with in 2021.
I'd just like to add on what Nick just said about how simple it can be to launch these campaigns. He's absolutely right. And to some degree, in some cases, a simple campaign is more effective than a nation state-backed campaign. We looked into something called, I think Graphica dubbed it secondary infection. It's a group thought to be Russian-backed, where they took a completely different approach than what we saw from the more well-known Internet Research Agency, where secondary infection was using single-use accounts almost exclusively from an operational security perspective. So they didn't want to use an account more than once and possibly reveal themselves to be a malicious actor. And so they would write one post using one account and then immediately burn that account and use another one. And so this is a nation state that is backing this effort, clearly throwing a lot of money into it. And yet that campaign, by all metrics, did not achieve any objective. They got into one semi-major news site over the course of their campaign, and that was it. So from an effectiveness standpoint, you really don't necessarily need the backing of a nation state to get your message across, which is really quite scary.
Well, if that's it, I will wrap it up here, but I would like to thank everyone for their time. Of course, as I mentioned, you can go to the Talos blog to check out our latest research on this. And then by the time this is published, Gene, I believe we'll have your blog post as well up on the Cisco security page. So everyone can check out her work there. And of course, you can follow Talos and Cisco Secure on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the above, to get the latest research from us as we continue to produce more content around this. So thanks, guys, for your time and taking time out of your busy schedules for this.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.